Okay, in this section, we're going to go ahead and start solving quadratic equations, okay? We're going to be using a method called using square roots, okay? This method doesn't always work, but when it does work, it's a pretty easy method to do. So there's only certain times we could do that. But first of all, let's discuss what is a quadratic equation. A quadratic equation, what makes it a quadratic equation is it has an x squared term. We're used to solving linear equations, stuff like y equals mx plus b, that's called a linear equation. So we've been solving equations before where you have like something like 5x plus 3 equals 8, okay? Where we have no exponent with our x, we just have a linear term of x, okay? Now when we're looking at quadratics, we're going to have a squared term. So the standard form of a quadratic is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Now that a, b, and c are just numbers. You'll often see a quadratic something like 8x squared plus 4x minus 3 equals 0. And when it's in standard form, it equals 0, but we're not always going to have it equal to 0 to start. Okay, the types of quadratics we're going to solve today will never have an x term. Okay, we only have an x squared term and a constant term. Okay, so I say here there is no bx term. Okay, before we get into solving quadratics, I want to take a look at something, hopefully something we could do real quickly. So I just want to evaluate the following. What is 5 squared? Well, if you type that in a calculator or you just do 5 times 5, you end up getting 25. Now on the second one, I have negative 5 in parentheses squared. So there I'm doing negative 5 times negative 5. And when I do that, I also get positive 25. Now you gotta be careful. If you type this in a calculator and do negative 5 squared, it'll tell you it's negative 25. So we need to put it in parentheses when we're doing this. Okay, that would give us the correct answer of positive 25. Okay, so now what if we go to solve this equation? I say x squared equals 25. What is the solution? Well, I just showed you there's two different things we could square to get 25. Okay, we could square 5 or we could square negative 5 and we get the correct answer. So when we're solving an equation where I have an x squared term only, what we're going to do is we're going to do a square root. And when I do the square root to undo a squared, I will always get a positive and negative answer. So if I do square root of 25, I get 5. So I want to say positive and negative 5. And typically in mathematics, that's how we write it. We'll just do a plus and minus in front. Okay? So we could either say x equals 5 and x equals negative 5 also. Okay? For our quizzes and stuff, you'll have to enter them as separate answers. Okay? So that's what I say here. We're going to have to use a positive and negative answer. Okay? So I want to kind of review real quick solving linear equations, and I'm actually going to use almost this exact same problem here a little bit later. So when I go to solve something like this, what steps do I take? Well, the first thing I want to do is I want to subtract 2. Okay? The reason I subtract 2 is it's the opposite of adding. Okay? So to get rid of addition, I subtract. So now I get 3x equals 75. And then next, this is 3 times x. To undo times, I do division, the opposite. Okay? So I then get x equals 25. Okay? So when I go to solve an equation x squared equals 36, we do whatever is the opposite of squaring a number. And the thing that is opposite of squaring a number, which I just mentioned in the previous page, is we take the square root. So if I have x squared equals 36, I take the square root of both sides. And if you have to, type square root of 36 in your calculator, and you end up getting 6. However, remember what I said just a little bit ago, we got to do plus and minus. So my answer is going to be x equals positive or negative 6. Okay? So I do have some steps here. I would recommend pausing the video and writing these down so you have them. Okay? So when we're solving an equation in which there is no bx term, okay, we're going to first of all isolate the x squared term, get it completely by itself. We will then take the square root and just be sure that we list our answer as positive and negative. Okay, so here I want to solve this equation for x for number 1. Now if you notice here, my x squared term is already done. I already isolated my x squared term. So next thing I want to do is I just take the square root of both sides, making sure to take positive and negative square root. So when I do the square root of 121, if you type that in the calculator, you end up getting 11. So my answer is going to be positive and negative 11. All right, moving on to the next question here. I want to go ahead and solve for x. So I have x squared equals negative 36. So again, to get rid of a squared, I take square root. Well, I should take a step back and note that the x squared term is in fact by itself. So I could take the square root. So I'm going to get x equals positive and negative. Now this is what we covered in our last section, is when I have a negative number here, the square root of a negative will give us an imaginary I. So I'm going to do this in 2 steps. So if I have square root of negative 36, I want to say that's an imaginary I times root 36. And then the square root of 36 is 6, so we'd say that is 6i. So my answer is x equals plus and minus 6i. Okay, so we do have to consider imaginary solutions as well. All right, now these next examples do require a few more steps. So here I want to solve for x. I have 3x squared equals 300. Okay, now I told you the first step to solving a quadratic is to isolate the x squared term. Okay, and right now that is not isolated, so I have to get rid of that 3. So just like this was an algebra 1 equation, I just divide everything by 3. That'll get rid of the 3 here. 300 divided by 3 is 100. So x squared equals 100. Now that I isolated this squared term, I could take the square root of both sides. Okay, so I get x equals square root of 10, or 100 is 10. And don't forget we need to do positive and negative. So my two answers are x equals 10 and then x equals negative 10. Okay, on the next example, I have negative x squared equals 72. I want to make sure I isolate the x squared term. In this case, I have a negative with it, so I have not completely isolated it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to think of that as having a negative 1 in front of it. So I have negative 1x squared, so to get rid of that negative 1, I have to divide both sides by negative 1. And that will end up giving me x squared equals negative 72. Now that we isolated the squared term, we take the square root of both sides, and so we get x equals plus and minus square root of negative 72. Now if you put that in the calculator, it'll tell you a non-real answer, or error, imaginary solution, okay? So remember, this is a negative here, so I could bring out that negative as an I, so I could say this is really x equals plus and minus I root 72. If you try to do square root of 72 in your calculator, you get an irrational number, you get a long decimal. So this is where I want to go ahead and simplify my radicals. So square root of 72, in our last section we simplified our radicals. Try and find the biggest perfect square that goes in there. I could try 4, it goes in there, 9 does, 16 does not, 25 does not, 36 does. So I can think of this as square root of 36 times square root of 2. Square root of 36 is 6, so I get 6 square root of 2. So my final answer is x equals plus and minus 6i root 2. And that's our final answer for that one. Okay, next example. This is the one I said I'd come back to. I basically did this problem earlier, only I had an x number here instead of an x squared. Okay, but just because it's an x squared, it doesn't change a whole bunch. We just have to do a square root at the end. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. So I get 3x squared equals 75. I can now divide both sides by 3. And now I have x squared equals 25. So I took the time to first of all isolate my squared term, at which point I could just undo squaring by doing square root. And so I end up getting x equals positive and negative 5. And that's it. We're done solving that problem. All right, I hope this helps.